Well, let me greet you again, and we're almost coming to the end of the Acts of the Apostles, and I want to recap a little bit because these chapters are quite critical, these last 5 chapters, in that it's really dealing with the end of Paul's life. And what has impressed me through this is the fact that while certainly on the day of Pentecost, Peter was the first one, and he certainly took the lead and was also the one who was told to go to the Gentiles with that vision of the unclean animals on the sheet. But when you really study this, it was Paul, more than any other, that really took the responsibility of dealing with the Gentiles. And Paul is desperately in conflict, as you can see that in chapter 23, the Jews tried to kill him. He was brought before the Sanhedrin, the ruling body of the Jews, and but they couldn't make a decision, and in actual fact a trap was set by the Jews to kill him, and it was the Romans who actually, a Roman centurion who rescued him and finally sent him down to Caesarea with a big detachment of soldiers. If you look, that's hundreds of soldiers. And so by chapter 24, then down in Caesarea, that the high priest comes down with the elders. And so even in Caesarea, it's the high priest, Ananias, and the elders who are bringing charges against Paul in front of the governor. And the interesting thing is that actually Paul remained a long time down here, because I find out that this is in chapter 24, by verse 24, Felix actually came with his wife Drusilla, who was a Jewess. So Felix was marginally open to what was happening. And then you find out that Felix, the eyesore is removed, and by verse 27, I'm still in chapter 24, Felix is succeeded by Festus. And Festus is a very different situation, but the scripture is clear. Paul was there for 2 years debating with Felix. So now by chapter 25, which we were dealing with last time, Festus goes to Jerusalem to really get to know what the charge. Felix is a Roman governor, by the way. What you're dealing with here is a combination of the Roman governors, and we end up with the king of the area, King Agrippa. So Festus finally consults with King Agrippa. And now when you come to the end of what I was saying last time, we come as far as the chapter 22. King Agrippa says to Festus, "I would like to hear this man myself." And Festus says, "Okay, tomorrow you can hear him." So this is chapter 25, verse 23. The next day, King Agrippa and his wife came, because he's the king of the area, as Herod had been king. Then what happens is he comes with great ceremony to the Roman governor. So you've got the Jewish king, and you've got the Roman governor. And Paul was brought in front of the two of them. And Festus says to King Agrippa, he says, the whole Jewish community has petitioned me about him in Jerusalem and here in Caesarea, saying that he should die. But I couldn't find anything wrong. And because he made his appeal to the emperor, I decided to send him to Rome. But now Festus is complaining and saying, Paul has, in actual fact, he says that if Paul had not appeased to Caesar, he would have been released. But he has appealed to Caesar, and because he's made his appeal to Caesar, to the Roman emperor, he decides to send Paul to Rome. But he says in verse 26, I don't have anything to write to the emperor, his majesty, about him. And how can we send him on trial in front of Caesar without actually having any charges to bring? And so really the whole investigation at this point is to see if they can find some accusation to write. Well, the response is by chapter 26. King Agrippa, who's now introduced, and this is at the end of the previous chapter, the beginning of this is Agrippa's meeting with Paul. Agrippa said to Paul, you can speak for yourself. So here comes the most incredible message, where Paul is dealing with himself, saying, of course, in verse 2, King Agrippa, I consider myself fortunate to stand before you as I make my defense against all the accusations of the Jews. Now, it's absolutely clear the Romans had nothing against Paul. The whole thing is, it's a Jewish conspiracy. So, making his defense, he says, I make my defense especially because you, King Agrippa, king over the province governed by the Romans, you, he says, Agrippa, because you are from Jerusalem, because you know all the Jewish customs, I beg you to listen to me patiently. He says, and Paul in his defense says, the Jews know all the way I have lived, know how I grew up, that he came from Tarsus, that he was also in Jerusalem. He was from a Jewish family, but because of where he lived, where he was born, he had Jewish citizenship. But he was actually in the strictest sect of the Jews, a Pharisee. They were the strictest. And now he says, and I'm looking here into verse 6, he says, because of my hope in what God has promised our fathers that I'm on trial. And yet he justified it in verse 7 to Agrippa, saying, this that I'm on trial for is the promise that our 12 tribes are hoping to see fulfilled. And then he goes on, King, it's because of this hope, the fulfillment of Jewish prophecy,